Chapter 6 of Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lisa Reichert. Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic by Benedetto Croce. Translated by Douglas Ainsley, 1865 to 1948. Chapter 6. Theoretic and Practical Activity. The intuitive and intellective forms exhaust, as we have said, all the theoretic form of the spirit, but it is not possible to know them thoroughly, nor to criticize another series of erroneous aesthetic theories, without first establishing clearly their relations with another form of the spirit, which is the practical form. The will. This form, or practical activity, is the will. We do not employ this word here in the sense of any philosophical system, in which the will is the foundation of the universe, the principle of things, and the true reality. Nor do we employ it in the ample sense of other systems, which understand by will the energy of the spirit or activity in general, making of every act of the human spirit an act of will. Neither such metaphysical nor such metaphorical meaning is ours. For us the will is, as generally accepted, that activity of the spirit which differs from the mere theoretical contemplation of things and is productive, not of knowledge but of actions. Action is really action, in so far as it is voluntary. It is not necessary to remark that in the will to do is included, in the scientific sense, also what is vulgarly called not doing. The will to resist, to reject, the prometheutic will, is also action. The will as an ulterior stage in respect to knowledge. Man understands things with the theoretical form, with the practical form he changes them. With the one he appropriates the universe, with the other he creates it. But the first form is the basis of the second, and the relation of double degree, which we have already found existing between aesthetic and logical activity, is repeated between these two on a larger scale. Knowledge independent of the will is thinkable. Will independent of knowledge is unthinkable. Blind will is not will. True will has eyes. How can we will without having before us historical intuitions, perceptions, of objects, and knowledge of, logical, relations, which enlighten us as to the nature of those objects? How can we really will if we do not know the world which surrounds us and the manner of changing things by acting upon them? Objections and elucidations. It has been objected that men of action, practical men in the eminent sense, are the least disposed to contemplate and to theorize. Their energy is not delayed in contemplation, it rushes at once into will. And conversely, that contemplative men, philosophers, are often very mediocre in practical matters, weak-willed, and therefore neglected and thrust aside in the tumult of life. It is easy to see that these distinctions are merely empirical and quantitative. Certainly, the practical man has no need of a philosophical system in order to act. But in the spheres where he does act, he starts from intuitions and concepts which are most clear to him. Otherwise, he could not will the most ordinary actions. It would not be possible to will to feed oneself, for instance, without knowledge of the food, and of the link of cause and effect between certain movements and certain organic sensations. Rising gradually to the more complex forms of action, for example to the political, how could we will anything politically good or bad, without knowing the real conditions of society, and consequently the means and expedients to be adopted? When the practical man feels himself in the dark about one or more of these points, or when he is seized with doubt, action either does not begin or stops. It is then that the theoretical moment, which in the rapid succession of human actions is hardly noticed and rapidly forgotten, becomes important and occupies consciousness for a longer time. And if this moment be prolonged, then the practical man may become Hamlet, divided between desire for action and his small amount of theoretical clarity as regards the situation and the means to be employed. And if he develop a taste for contemplation and discovery, and leave willing and acting, to a more or less great extent, to others, there is formed in him the calm disposition of the artist, of the man of science, or of the philosopher, who are sometimes unpractical or altogether blameworthy. These observations are all obvious. Their exactitude cannot be denied. Let us, however, repeat that they are founded on quantitative distinctions and do not disprove, but confirm the fact that an action, however slight it be, cannot really be an action, that is, an action that is willed, unless it be preceded by cognoscitive activity. Critique of practical judgments, or judgments of value. Some psychologists, on the other hand, place before practical action an altogether special class of judgments, which they call practical judgments, or judgments of value. They say that in order to resolve to perform an action, it is necessary to have judged, this action is useful, this action is good. And at first sight this seems to have the testimony of consciousness on its side. But he who observes better and analyzes with greater subtlety, discovers that such judgments follow instead of preceding the affirmation of the will. They are nothing but the expression of the already exercised volition. A good or useful action is an action that is willed. It will always be impossible to distill from the objective study of things a single drop of usefulness or goodness. We do not desire things because we know them to be good or useful, but we know them to be good and useful because we desire them. Here, too, the rapidity with which the facts of consciousness follow one another has given rise to an illusion. Practical action is preceded by knowledge, but not by practical knowledge, or better by the practical. To obtain this, it is first necessary to have practical action. The third moment, therefore, of practical judgments, or judgments of value, is altogether imaginary. It does not come between the two moments or degrees of theory and practice. That is why there exist no normative sciences in general, which regulate or command, discover and indicate values to the practical activity, because there is none for any other activity, assuming every science already realized and that activity developed, which it afterwards takes as its object. Exclusion of the practical from the aesthetic. These distinctions established, we must condemn as erroneous every theory which confuses aesthetic with practical activity, or introduces the laws of the second into the first. That science is theory and art practice has been many times affirmed. Those who make this statement, and look upon the aesthetic fact as a practical fact, do not do so capriciously, or because they are groping in the void, but because they have their eye on something which is really practical. But the practical which they are looking at is not aesthetic, nor within aesthetic. It is outside and beside it, and although they are often found united, they are not necessarily united, that is to say, by the bond of identity of nature. The aesthetic fact is altogether completed in the expressive elaboration of the impressions. When we have conquered the word within us, conceived definitely and vividly a figure or a statue, or found a musical motive, expression is born and is complete. There is no need for anything else. If after this we should open our mouths and will to open them, to speak, or our throats to sing, and declare in a loud voice and with extended throat what we have completely said or sung to ourselves, or if we should stretch out and will to stretch out our hands to touch the notes of the piano, or to take up the brushes and the chisel, making thus in detail those movements in which we have already done rapidly, and doing so in such a way as to leave more or less durable traces, this is all an addition, a fact which obeys quite different laws to the first, and with these laws we have not to occupy ourselves for the moment. Let us, however, here recognize that this second movement is a production of things, a practical fact, or a fact of will. It is customary to distinguish the internal from the external work of art. The terminology seems here to be infelicitous, for the work of art, the aesthetic work, is always internal, and that which is called external is no longer a work of art. Others distinguish between aesthetic fact and artistic fact, meaning by the second the external or practical stage, which may and generally does follow the first. But in this case, it is simply a case of linguistic usage, doubtless permissible, although perhaps not opportune. Critique of the theory of the end of art and of the choice of the content. For the same reasons, the search for the end of art is ridiculous, when it is understood of art as art. And since to fix an end is to choose, the theory that the content of art must be selected is another form of the same error. A selection from among impressions and sensations implies that these are already expressions. Otherwise, how can a selection be made among what is continuous and indistinct? To choose is to will this and not to will that, and this and that must be before us, they must be expressed. Practice follows, it does not precede theory. Expression is free inspiration. The true artist, in fact, finds himself big with his theme, he knows not how. He feels the moment of birth drawing near, but he cannot will it or not will it. If he were to wish to act in opposition to his inspiration, to make an arbitrary choice, if, born Anacreon, he were to wish to sing of Atreus and of Alcides, his lyre would warn him of his mistake, echoing only of Venus and of love, notwithstanding his efforts to the contrary. Practical innocence of art. The theme or content cannot, therefore, be practically or morally charged with epithets of praise or of blame. When critics of art remark that a theme is badly selected, in cases where that observation has a just foundation, it is a question of blaming, not the selection of the theme, which would be absurd, but the manner in which the artist has treated it. The expression has failed, owing to the contradictions which it contains. And when the same critics rebel against the theme or the content as being unworthy of art and blameworthy, in respect to works which they proclaim to be artistically perfect, if these expressions really are perfect, there is nothing to be done but to advise the critics to leave the artists in peace, for they cannot get inspiration save from what has made an impression upon them. The critics should think rather of how they can effect changes in nature and in society, in order that those impressions may not exist. If ugliness were to vanish from the world, if universal virtue and felicity were established there, perhaps artists would no longer represent perverse or pessimistic sentiments, but sentiments that are calm, innocent, and joyous, like Arcadians of a real Arcady. But so long as ugliness and turpitude exist in nature and impose themselves on the artist, it is not possible to prevent the expression of these things also, and when it has arisen, factum infectum fieri nequit. We speak thus entirely from the aesthetic point of view, and from that of pure aesthetic criticism. We do not delay to pass here in review the damage which the criticism of choice does to artistic production, with the prejudices which it produces or maintains among the artists themselves, and with the contrast which it occasions between artistic impulse and critical exigencies. It is true that sometimes it seems to do some good also, by assisting the artists to discover themselves, that is, their own impressions and their own inspiration, and to acquire consciousness of the task which is, as it were, imposed upon them by the historical moment in which they live, and by their individual temperament. In these cases, criticism of choice merely recognizes and aids the expressions which are already being formed. It believes itself to be the mother, where, at most, it is only the midwife. The independence of art. The impossibility of choice of content completes the theorem of the independence of art, and is also the only legitimate meaning of the expression art for art's sake. Art is thus independent of science, as it is of the useful and the moral. Let it not be feared that thus may be justified art that is frivolous or cold, since that which is truly frivolous or cold is so because it has not been raised to expression. Or, in other words, frivolity and frigidity come always from the form of the aesthetic elaboration, from the lack of a content, not from the material qualities of the content. Critique of the saying, "The style is the man." The saying, "The style is the man," can also not be completely criticized, save by starting from the distinction between the theoretic and the practical, and from the theoretic character of the aesthetic activity. Man is not simply knowledge and contemplation, he is also will, which contains in it the cognoscitive moment. Now the saying is either altogether void, as when it is understood that the man is the style, in so far as he is style, that is to say, the man, but only in so far as he is an expression of activity, or it is erroneous, when the attempt is made to deduce from what a man has seen and expressed that which he has done and willed, inferring thereby that there is a necessary link between knowing and willing. Many legends in the biographies of artists have sprung from this erroneous identification, since it seemed impossible that a man who gives expression to generous sentiments should not be a noble and generous man in practical life, or that the dramatist who gives a great many stabs in his plays should not himself have given a few at least in real life. Vainly do the artists protest, "Lasciva est nobis pagina, vita proba." They are merely taxed in addition with lying and hypocrisy. O you poor women of Verona, how far more subtle you were when you founded your belief that Dante had really descended to hell upon his dusky countenance! Yours was at any rate a historical conjecture. Critique of the concept of sincerity in art. Finally, sincerity, imposed upon the artist as a duty, this law of ethics, which, they say, is also a law of aesthetic, arises from another equivoque. For by sincerity is meant either the moral duty not to deceive one's neighbour, and in that case is foreign to the artist, for he in fact deceives no one, since he gives form to what is already in his mind. He would deceive only if he were to betray his duty as an artist by a lesser devotion to the intrinsic necessity of his task. If lies and deceit are in his mind, then the form which he gives to these things cannot be deceit or lies, precisely because it is aesthetic. The artist, if he be a charlatan, a liar, or a miscreant, purifies his other self by reflecting it in art, or by sincerity is meant fullness and truth of expression, and it is clear that this second sense has nothing to do with the ethical concept. The law, which is at once ethical and aesthetic, reveals itself in this case in a word employed alike by ethic and aesthetic. End of chapter 6. Recording by Lisa Reichert.